us in the US. Good afternoon for those who are in Europe, Russia, Eurasia, and good evening to our speaker who is based in Singapore. So it's already end of the day for him. That's the good side of the difficult pandemic situation we have, is that we are able now to do all our seminar online and to connect with people who are 12 hours away from us. So Thank you for joining us today for the Central Asia Program online seminar at GW, and thank you to our speaker Raffaello Pantucci for joining us from Singapore. We will be today discussing, as I was saying just before, if you were already online, something that I think everybody watching Central Asia has been asking, is that how the current COVID-19 pandemic is reshaping the relationship between China and Central Asia. That's, of course, one of the big issues for the region, because China is both at the origin of the virus, the one giving help, the one trying to push its own agenda. So you have China on all sides of Central Asia when you look from the region around. So it's really great to have Raffaello here to present. And I must say, he has just also published a paper that you can find on our website and download it, that is kind of presenting the research he has been doing. So Raffaello, and I'm happy to present him, but I'm sure many people already know him. Raffaello is a senior research fellow at RUSI in London, and is now kind of commuting, if I may say, between London and Singapore. I mean, no, not this last month. Working also in one of the main think tanks in Singapore, linked to the NTU, the National Technical University. He has been working on Chinese interest in Central Asia since several years, and he has a book under contract, so we are waiting for the book to be out. Will be a great read. And he's also working on terrorism and counter-terrorism in Central Asia. So once again, welcome, Raffaello. Thank you so much for being here. I give you the floor for about 30 minutes, and then I will open the floor for Q&A. For the Q&A, as we plan to, we hope to have more than 100 participants. I will ask people to ask questions in the chat and in the Q&A box that you have on the right of your screen, and then I will moderate the discussion, and I will do my best to have all the questions that will be asked discussed. So Raffaello, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you to Jeanette as well, your colleagues, for organizing this event and for inviting me to come and talk to you, and also for publishing the paper, which I wrote drawing on sort of the research I've been doing, looking specifically at China's relationships to Central Asia and how it's evolving under COVID. You know, it's a very strange time to be trying to do research on international relations, being unable to go anywhere, even stranger to do it from a city-state, which is even more cut off in some ways than lots of other places and countries. But what I thought I'd do is I thought I'd talk through my sense of how China's relationship with Central Asia had evolved under the shadow of COVID-19. A lot of this is captured in the paper, but I'm going to try to take a little bit beyond that, to try to offer some thoughts about where I think this is going and how I think this is going to change the relationship going forwards. And to briefly summarize at the beginning, I think it's very easy to say that, frankly, the biggest change, and in some ways what we're going to see in the relationship between China and Central Asia as a result of COVID, is going to be very much the relationship's reflection of what we've seen everywhere else as a result of COVID, which is essentially a kind of supercharging of things that have already been going on. So in much the same way as I think the relationship with Central Asia and China have been developing for some time, where China's been developing an ever closer and more intimate and sort of tight relationship with the region, I think what we're seeing happen as well to COVID is going to make that even more real. And I think it's going to set in place a series of things which are going to continue to sort of enhance this ability and in some way speed up a process that was already underway. But to track back a minute, I think it's important to look at origins. And I think origins are really interesting within this context, because when we think about Central Asia and we think about China and we think about where it would be that the first kind of, expressions of COVID-19 would come from, you would expect it to be directly from China. And yet, interestingly enough, it takes really until mid-March that all of the countries start reporting that they have found cases. And interestingly, the ones that report, which is Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, who all reported around the same time in mid-March that they had sort of confirmed cases of COVID-19. they all report that they come from other places than China, which is surprising when you think that they're sitting right next door to China. Now, there's many reasons to suspect why this could actually be the case. Ultimately, if we look at Xinjiang, for example, the place where Central Asia comes into contact with China, Xinjiang seems to have had quite low reporting of instances of COVID-19. Of course, reporting could be the issue here. It could be that there are more cases than are getting reported. But at the same time, even if we look at the regions of China as they came out from lockdown, Xinjiang was one of the earliest ones. And it seems as the authorities there weren't very concerned about the spread of the virus in their particular region. It could be that it's a very spread out community over very long distances. So that made it hard maybe for the same sort of community transfer to happen that we saw in other places. But it's certainly interesting to observe that really it is until mid-March that we see Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan all reporting cases and reporting that they were linked to people traveling back from Saudi Arabia in Kyrgyzstan's case, or Germany and France in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan's case. Tajikistan doesn't actually report that it has cases of COVID-19 until late April. So it's quite difficult to really know what to make of that. And Turkmenistan, I don't believe, have yet reported that they've confirmed having cases of COVID-19. So, I think it's sort of a moot question there. I think the interesting thing to think about, though, is that while we could give all sorts of reasons as to why this is the case, and it could be, as I said, to do with the fact that Xinjiang appears to have suffered less from contact with the disease than other places, it's also interesting to look back a little bit to mid-December, when, to a certain amount of fanfare in Kazakhstan, it was reported that Wuhan was going to be one of the first places, the Wuhan markets were going to start selling Kazakh products. And there was a big push by the Kazakh government to emphasize the fact that their products were now being sold directly into markets in Wuhan. And this is, the point being that it was now new access, direct access to another large Chinese market of around, a city of 12 million people. And this happened in mid-December, when presumably the virus was already running rampant. And so presumably at that point, you already had sort of planes shuttling with people back and forth. And yet, we don't really see official reports of cases appearing. Now, what we do see throughout the kind of January and February period, in January in particular, is various rumors starting to run wild. So as the virus really takes off in China, and we see Chinese cities going into lockdown, and we see the narrative in China turning in of this big virus becoming a big problem, we see other countries starting to close their borders. We do start to see lots of stories running around within Central Asia of the virus spreading, and it really articulates itself as a very kind of crude form of xenophobia. So we hear stories, we report stories of Chinese being attacked or chased in markets in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. In Uzbekistan as well, there were some sort of rumors, but it was very difficult to pin down specific stories. But we see these stories going about Chinese being targeted as individuals who are potentially carriers of the disease. And we see all the usual sort of stuff going around about, fears about China articulating in individuals. In one particular case I was able to find in late January, there was a train in southern Kazakhstan that actually had to stop kind of in the middle of nowhere at some random stop because the passengers on board got very concerned about two Chinese passengers that were on board, believing them to be sick with the virus. It's not clear exactly what was happening. These people could have just been coughing and everyone kind of reacted negatively around them. Anyway, they were forced to disembark. The Kazakh authorities sort of took them away, tested them. They turned out to test negative. Everything sort of continued. But I think what's interesting is we see that this kind of fear of China articulating itself very early, far before we see the governments even admitting that the disease has actually taken hold within their countries. But what is interesting, and we do see the governments acknowledging throughout the sort of January period, and again, I have to emphasize that it isn't all of the governments. It's very difficult, as I think everybody on this call knows, as people who know Central Asia well, to get any accurate information out of Turkmenistan. And frankly, it's very difficult to know what is exactly going on there. But if we look at all the other countries of Central Asia, what's interesting is that throughout January, we see all of them sending aid to China, recognizing that something large and substantial is happening. All of the governments make a show of sending a certain volume of aid, not particularly large amounts that are necessarily game-changing to China, but more kind of symbolic gestures of showing that they are supporting their great neighbor. And we see this happening sort of throughout January and even I think into early sort of February. And then this sets an interesting stage for then when we see the disease taking off in Central Asia, or we see the governments at least admitting that the disease is taking off, we see them all starting to ask reciprocation from China. And it has to be said that China really seems to reciprocate in spades. And we see throughout, from I think it's about late March, that we start to see this aid being sort of officially recorded as coming in. And what's interesting is that even in the case of Tajikistan, a country that didn't admit that it had cases until deep into April, we even see in late March, that while we see aid flowing to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, we also see them handing over aid to Tajikistan, presumably to help them prepare or to help them deal with an issue which they haven't quite sort of admitted to yet. And this aid really, I've been trying to track the sort of numbers, and it's very difficult to, because after a while, you see the first sorts of shipments which sort of come over a certain tonnage, and then after that, more and more starts to come, and it starts to come from all sorts of different directions. We see aid coming from different regions across China. We see aid being sent centrally by the government. We see a lot coming from Xinjiang government in particular, but really it seems to be coming from sort of all over China, where different regions are sending their contribution to help support Central Asia manage the problems of COVID-19. And we see it coming from all sorts of other areas as well. So we see Chinese companies that are quite heavily invested in a lot of these countries. In some cases, we see the companies banding together and sending shipments of aid together from China, alongside some of these shipments coming from different regions. In other cases, we see the local embassies in China getting sort of large checks from these companies and dispersing this to the health ministries in the respective Central Asian country that they're coming from, that they're representing, and that they're in. And then we also see a very interesting foundation sort of chiming in, which is the Jack Ma Foundation. Jack Ma, who people may know or may not know, is the founder of the big site Alibaba, which is kind of China's answer to Amazon, this sort of behemoth of the Chinese internet, which is a huge company that's really spread its tentacles, much like Amazon, into every sort of facet of kind of online digital life. Anyway, Jack Ma created a foundation called the Jack Ma Foundation, and this institution has been sending aid to the Central Asian countries in substantial amounts, big plane loads of stuff, of personal protective equipment and other necessary kit. We also see a certain amount of effort coming in from the PLA, and the PLA sent over at least 1 or 2 shipments of aid to its counterparts in, again, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, that was reported, but potentially also with Turkmenistan, we just haven't necessarily seen it reported. And we also see in Kyrgyzstan in particular, the local embassy makes an effort at making particular connection with the local border guards. And then on top of all this sort of physical aid being sent, we also see doctors getting sent. So Chinese doctors learning from their experiences in China, coming over to help train their kind of Central Asian counterparts, to teach them from their experiences, to show them how it's gone. We even see some Chinese traditional medicine being sort of practiced and advanced as part of this. Whenever we look at the sort of declarations or announcements around these troops when they visit, the doctors will talk about also bringing specialists along in TCM to help the locals, because in some parts of China, it's believed that this has actually been helping people deal with some of these problems. And so we can see this kind of surge of aid and people, and then also at a kind of webinar level, much like this, we see Chinese doctors offering training remotely to their counterparts in Central Asia, helping them figure out and helping them learn from their experiences. Finally, on the sort of direct aid side, we also see that the Confucius Institute up in Khujand in Tajikistan, which is partnered with the China Petroleum University in Qingdao, they translated into Russian a manual that had been developed in China of tips of how to manage COVID-19 and how to sort of prepare the response. So we really see this surge of aid coming in from kind of March onwards, and even a little bit before as well, as China sort of reciprocates a lot of what it had received in the first place from Central Asia. And of course, China's been trumpeting this medical diplomacy quite loudly and making a big show of how successful it's been. It's quite interesting to observe that even amongst all this kind of positive stories of stuff coming in, we also do see some disagreements. And I think in Kazakhstan, there were some interesting disagreements which appeared to happen when a delegation of doctors from Xinjiang did a tour of Kyrgyzstan. I think it was in mid-April, where there was apparently a dispute because the Kazakh doctors were using the personal protective equipment to the standards that they saw being advanced by the WHO, and the Chinese doctors thought that this wasn't adequate enough. And so there's a bit of a dispute which got reported about what was actually happening in terms of the aid response that was being given here. But I think the key point is that China really kind of flooded the region with aid and with support as a result, and quite loudly did it as well. What I haven't done, unfortunately, which it might be useful to do at some point, is to look at how much this matches up against what's been coming from Russia, or what's been coming from the United States, or from Europe even. I know the United States has given over a certain amount of large amounts of dollar checks to some of these countries, and I'm sure that has been very well received. And I'm sure that Russia and European countries are doing this as well. I know of some reporting, but I haven't stacked up all the numbers. But I think what's certainly noticeable is that China's done it in a very sort of holistic way in terms of really contributing not only the physical equipment, not only sort of monetary support, but also people coming over, also in terms of sort of connections online to help people learn from their experiences, as well as sort of giving them some of the manuals that they had developed themselves. And I think what's also interesting to see is that the SCO has got in on this story as well. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which again, I'm going to presume a level of knowledge about amongst the audience, the SCO has taken quite an interesting role within the kind of response to COVID-19 in Central Asia in particular. And we can see that not only has the Secretary General been sort of pushing the fact that the SCO can offer itself as a kind of regional platform to help support people's response, and he's talked very positively about how China's been managing the problems around COVID-19. But we can also see them doing more practical things. So, for example, there's a company called Weidong Cloud Learning, which is a Chinese online learning platform and company, quite a large one, that already has quite a big global footprint, that has MOUs signed with, I think it's UNESCO, signed with a lot of countries around the world, which has been for a long time sort of working at developing its relations with Central Asia, and has already had a sort of formal MOU signed with the SCO. But under the auspices of kind of response to COVID-19, we see that this company has really sort of boosted its efforts in the region. So much so that the SCO Secretary General wrote a letter of thanks to them, saying how wonderful they'd been in terms of supporting the Central Asian countries and SCO member states more broadly, but Central Asians in particular, during the difficult time of COVID-19. Of course, as I'm sure is happening in the United States and other places that might be online, as a result of sort of COVID-19 lockdowns, schools have been closed. So a lot of sort of learning has moved online. So it's interesting to see that the Chinese platform is being sort of championed as the platform that can be used in the region and shown successfully to be used in the region to help children learn. We can also see that Alibaba has continued a sort of push that we saw starting last year to specifically engage with the SCO. Again, in about August last year, during some large summits, we saw that Jack Ma met with the SCO Secretary General, as well as a series of the SCO Central Asian leaders in particular. And also his company, Alibaba, signed some large agreements with Russian counterparts to develop Alibaba and its platforms, which includes online sales platforms, as well as sort of online payments platforms, as well as sort of chat functions and everything else, to be real platforms for the entire SCO region, for the Central Asian countries, for Russia, and really to help all of these countries sort of connect up across this entire space. And we see that during this period, the Alibaba in particular has been sponsoring, alongside the SCO, some of these webinars to help Chinese doctors connect with their Central Asian counterparts. The SCO ones that were sponsored by Alibaba were actually opened up to Belarus and Azerbaijan as well. So it's kind of beyond just the SCO and Central Asian community. But interesting, it doesn't look like the Indians or Pakistanis participated, which I think is probably a reflection of the fact that they did it in Russian. But it's interesting to put that alongside the fact, that the SCO is connecting with Alibaba in this way. And also during this period, it's noticeable that on the SCO website, we see a number of reports of the Secretary General meeting with senior officials or senior business people, or senior managers, within Alibaba, as well as some of Alibaba's competitors like Jingdong. And it seems to be very focused on the SCO trying to build a connection with some of these online platforms, particularly Chinese ones. I mean, it's interesting to see them using COVID-19 response as a kind of platform to help enhance their engagement with not only Central Asia, but also the kind of broader SCO, but with a particular focus, I would argue, on Central Asia. And it's interesting to look at this within the sort of perspective of some of the bigger questions that have been raised out of China's engagement with Central Asia through the kind of lens of COVID-19. Because of course, from the Central Asian countries' perspectives, COVID-19 has been not only a human disaster in terms of the kind of the casualties, the people made sick and who have died as a result of the disease, but also economically, it's been a huge hit. And Central Asia suffered from this in a number of different directions. First and foremost, of course, there is the massive hit to remittances that we see as a result of the sort of, the slump in the Russian economy. In fact, the global slowdown that we've seen and what that means for all the kind of Central Asian workers that, work in foreign countries that generate these huge amounts of income that sort of support Central Asian economies. But then on top of that, you had the kind of double whammy hit of the slump in commodities prices. Commodities prices not only affect one of the biggest markets that Central Asia has relationships with in Russia, but also, of course, with China, but also, of course, directly in Central Asia, where some of the economies are still very dependent on hydrocarbons and commodities, income to help support their national economy. So you get a kind of double whammy of slowdown in one of the biggest things that you sell, as well as a slowdown in income from remittances from your workforce that's working abroad. And then additional to that, of course, you're creating a problem which will probably take itself a little longer to articulate itself, which is a problem of having a sort of large, young, relatively young male workforce that is unemployed or underemployed. With kind of nothing to do, no jobs and no prospects, and waiting for things to kind of pick up again. So you're really seeing their economies getting hit from all sorts of directions. So from that perspective, they're very keen, I think, to get the Chinese economy in particular to get it moving again, because they can see that this is one of the big economies, which if it does get moving again, will have a positive knock-on effect for them. And so you can see, this has been most clearly articulated in the conversation between Kyrgyzstan and China, where we've seen the Kyrgyz government request that, some of its debts with China, amongst the many other debtors it has, it's been asking for some debt relief with them, and it appears as though a lot of that debt has been rolled over, though I haven't been able to track down exactly what the details are of that debt relief that's been experienced with China in particular. But they've also been very keen to try to get some of the kind of BRI energy going once again, because I think, while people can be quite cynical about sort of BRI and, the fact that large deals are signed, but nothing ever really materializes, I would argue that BRI in particular, and with Central Asia in particular, this, what has sort of been rebranded as BRI, is really a story that's been going on for almost 20 years now, of Chinese sort of investment into Central Asia and Chinese economic connections with Central Asia that have only kind of since 2013 been rebranded as BRI. But the idea of China sort of helping or connecting with Central Asia, helping build up their infrastructure, helping open up their markets, ultimately as a selfish act, because it will help Xinjiang, it will help China's West open up and develop more as well. It's something that's been going on for a very long time. And so I think you're seeing that there's push to kind of re-engage and reinvigorate BRI, which is how China articulates it. And you can see in various conversations that Chinese officials have had with their Central Asian counterparts. I noticed just recently that Wang Yi, the foreign minister, had a conversation with his Turkmen counterpart, during which they talked about, getting things going once again, getting BRI moving once again, finding ways of getting their economies, and as well as congratulating each other for doing such a wonderful job in terms of managing COVID-19. We can see that there is a real push to try to sort of focus on getting BRI moving once again, because, from a Central Asian perspective, this is a way of helping to get their economies moving once again. I think, Kazakhstan opening a direct economic connection with Wuhan back in mid-December is kind of emblematic of this. Kazakhstan, like all the other Central Asians, can see China is a giant potential market, as well as a giant sort of economic opportunity. And so it's clearly one you want to connect with. So rebuilding that connection quickly will be essential to help get the economy moving once again. Of course, that also means that you're going to be strengthening that connection. And as I said before, in terms of the kind of e-commerce and e-side of, electronic side of the equation, I think that is going to deepen alongside the kind of more physical sales that you'll see sort of shuttling back and forth. A sort of almost final point I'll touch upon is that, of course, with all this sort of wonderful positivity around China reciprocating aid and BRI providing a new sort of economic opportunity in answer to all these problems that the region's feeling, it's always important to remember that there are, of course, some really fundamental problems. And I think some fundamental tensions that exist. And I think if we think back to what I was talking about at the beginning around some of the expressions of kind of xenophobia and fear that we saw in early January, a very basic kind of, fear of the Chinese and specific Chinese workers and Chinese traders in their markets. This is something that we can see also has consistently been quite a substantial problem in the region. And it's articulated itself through the lens of COVID-19. As I mentioned before, there was a dispute between doctors in Kazakhstan, which is quite an interesting wrinkle to appear amongst what was otherwise a very sort of positive media blitz. There was a problem in, I think it was February, when some Chinese diplomats were traveling back to Tajikistan and refused to sort of undergo or submit to the quarantine that the Tajik government wanted to put them under as a result of their returning from China. And this caused a sort of minor diplomatic spat between the two countries. If we track back to Turkmenistan even, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but it's interesting to look while we see all of the other four countries sort of formally admitting when their first cases were. The first instance that might be traced to COVID-19 appearing in Turkmenistan appears to be on a flight in February from China to Turkmenistan, where a passenger on board was taken sick. The flight was rerouted from Ashgabat to Turkmenabad, and the individual on board was sort of taken off to a sanatorium. But, unfortunately, we don't really know anything more that happened about that. But, those kind of individual stories, show how through the lens of COVID-19, we still do see these tensions express themselves. But then also, and this, articulates itself at a bigger level as well, in terms of kind of the traditional tensions that we've seen, in terms of pushback to some of these large infrastructure projects or some of these large Chinese projects happening in the region. In mid-February, there was the decision to suspend the large logistics center that was being built at Batken. I haven't been able to track down, maybe someone on the call can tell me whether it was the Kyrgyz government that pulled the plug or whether it was the Chinese company that pulled the plug. But what is clear is that it was as a result of the protests and public anger that we saw against the project that the project was ultimately suspended. And that, is something which reflects a sort of consistent problem that we've seen where, the public aren't happy always about these projects, complains quite vociferously. And in some cases, and we've seen this mostly in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, projects have had to be, hushed up or delayed, or in this particular case, even suspended. But then very interestingly, I think, and in some ways, this probably is a bigger comment on China than is necessarily on Central Asia. What I haven't been able to kind of pin down is why we've seen Chinese narratives seem to pick on Kazakhstan in particular. And I say this has articulated itself in two ways. One, in a spat that took off in sort of April, where we saw that an article that was published in the Chinese online media was picked up in Kazakhstan, which reported, it was part of a wave of articles that came out of what appears to be a clickbait farm in Xi'an, which is publishing a series of articles about all the Chinese neighbors saying how all these countries were so envious of China that they wanted to return to China. And, of course, this is, not really the case. This article was, was sort of online fake news, nonsense, whatever you want. But it escalated to the point of causing a diplomatic spat between Kazakhstan and China. And interesting enough, the Chinese embassy in Kazakhstan, which has become quite vocal in terms of its kind of articulations publicly, in contrast to, reflecting actually what we've seen in terms of Chinese diplomacy around the world. Embassies all over the place seem to be having a great time now with Twitter and Facebook, really pushed back aggressively on this and saying this was all some sort of Western concoction. But I think it did really stir up some anger within Kazakhstan. And then even more curiously, a kind of fake news story or disinformation narrative, which emanated originally from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which pointed to some of the labs, old Soviet labs that are kind of dotted around the former Soviet space that the US government, Department of Defense in particular, spent a lot of money in terms of securing and funding and developing. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs started pointing to these as potentially the source of the virus. And it appears as though the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs started to echo these comments and these stories that were coming out of Moscow. And Kazakhstan in particular is singled out as a place that might be hosting a particular lab where reportedly a particular American scientist went a few years ago and did some investigations into bats and coronaviruses amongst them, which paints a very tidy conspiratorial link to where we are today. So I think I'll sort of draw it to a close there, conscious that I talked for, I think, in my allocated time, and I would like very much to have a discussion and hear people's questions and thoughts. But I think the fundamental point is that what we're essentially seeing through the expression of COVID-19 is kind of an extension of what we've seen before, which was a growing tightening of the relationship between China and Central Asia, very much China on the ascendant. But while the economic links continue to tie, and as I say, they're spreading into all sorts of other areas as well, as I articulated, particularly the sort of e-space, we can still see the old tensions remain and the old fears and issues continue to express themselves as well. So I'll leave it at that. Marlene, I think I'm going to let you manage the Q&A rather than read off my small screen, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Raffaello, for this really great and very comprehensive presentation. So we have several questions. Let me begin with, so some are kind of broad, some are very specific, some are mostly on Central Asia, some are mostly on China. One that is really at the juncture, it's the kind of gap between the way Chinese media are very proudly discussing the role of the Belt and Road Initiative in the region recovers, and the kind of classic skeptic position that you can see from Central Asian commentators, and especially from those from Kyrgyzstan, pointing to the issue of the famous China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan railway project and how much it's kind of blocked on the Kyrgyz side. So could you tell us what you think? Do you expect how it will be proceed? How do you think it will be the future of this railway project?
I think that's it's a really interesting and difficult question, and I think, you know, I think on that particular project that we're talking about, I think it's interesting to observe that we have seen the Uzbeks quite specifically refer to this as a really important project and one that needs to get going now because it'll be part of the answer to COVID-19. And it's interesting how they articulate this, because it's not only about, you know, BRI and connectivity and all those wonderful things, but it's quite specifically about the fact that this will create a safe corridor between their countries to allow goods to transit. So the Uzbeks have been talking this up. They held at least 1 or 2 meetings in which they were quite specifically talking about it. And what's interesting is from the Chinese side, they've actually sent a train now from Gansu, which is taking a trainload of products to Uzbekistan, which is theoretically tracking this route. And as it's been reported online, I haven't been able to track the kind of exact, you know, the thing as it's moving along. I think the train seems to be going across China, get out to kind of Urkistan, where I think the goods get transported onto trucks and then driven essentially across Kyrgyzstan, to then get put back onto a train into Uzbekistan to then take over into Uzbek markets. And then I think what you're going to see is the same thing going back. And I think they're talking about sending Uzbek cotton back down the same route. So I think from the Uzbek and the Chinese perspective, they're clearly signaling that this route is going to happen, you know, come hell or high weather. And I think it's interesting to observe that even while this discussion was happening, we still saw some Kyrgyz MPs in particular pushing back and saying there's all sorts of problems around this. But they seem to be being overridden by their big partners. So, you know, at the end of the day, the project's not going to happen unless the Kyrgyz agree for it to happen, because the infrastructure has to be built on their territory. But, you know, if we put that alongside the comments that I've seen from Kyrgyz officials talking about how they need to get some of this infrastructure projects moving again, and they need to get Chinese workers back into Kyrgyzstan, because after Chinese New Year, actually, a lot of them left. That's back in February, and just didn't come back because then the virus took off, and so transport links were cut. You know, but these workers are quite important getting these projects moving again. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that actually finally getting forced through as a result, because there's kind of a dissonance, I think, within Kyrgyzstan, where on the one hand, you know, they're saying we want the infrastructure, but then this one piece of infrastructure both of the others want, everyone has been pushing for, and now actually kind of pretending is there, actually isn't physically there. So I think the logic of it will force it to actually happen at some point soon.
Great, thank you. We have also several questions about something you mentioned at the beginning, which is this kind of strange fact that the first cases were mostly reported as those coming from Europe or from the Middle East, and not coming from China. And so there are kind of two ways of interpreting it, right? One is that it was not reported at the beginning, either because it was from China or because just at that time the government were not interested in reporting these kind of things and were hoping that they would kind of be able to avoid it. Or if it's the reality, and that's one of the questions we have, what does that tell us about, in fact, the low level of human connectivities between China and Central Asia? Could that also be that aspect that in fact, except in some kind of border zone, the connectivity is quite low?
It's a really, look, I think it's a really difficult question to pin down, frankly, because, you know, the Central Asians cut all their border links at the same time as the Russians, and at the same time as most of the world, which was late January. At that point, they started suspending flights from China. The border crossings were all closed, sort of one after the other, and very quickly. You know, but I think the point I would make is that, you know, what we don't know is at what point was the virus really circulating. You know, I now know there's reports that we see in Europe now of cases potentially tracing back as early as December. You know, and if we think that, as I mentioned, in mid-December, Kazakhstan was, you know, talking up the fact that they had this strong link with Wuhan, which means at least one plane load of people went back and forth to Wuhan, and they opened direct flights, and they, you know, I struggle, frankly, to believe that really the first cases emerged in mid-March. Also because I'm quite struck by the fact that they were all kind of reported around the same time. So it's kind of, I think it's like 12, 13, 14, 15, those dates in March is where we see Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan all reporting at roughly the same time, oh, we have cases. So I'm a bit skeptical, frankly, of that element of it. So I don't really know what we can say about what this says to us about human connectivity between the region. I mean, you know, I would say that it's notable in some ways that how low Xinjiang has seemingly suffered from the disease. And yes, again, we can question whether reporting is reliable or accurate there. But, you know, it is possible that China was able to kind of contain things, and Xinjiang is ultimately quite, you know, it's a big empty area which is not that well connected to everywhere else. This is why you see a lot of internal infrastructure development still going on in Xinjiang. You know, it's possible that the kind of human connection back and forth, which would happen from Xinjiang to Central Asia in the first instance, as well as sort of from the big cities, it's possible that that is relatively low, and actually those people weren't necessarily the carriers. So, you know, I'm afraid I don't have a perfect answer to that because I'm really, the reporting is so spotty and unreliable.
Yeah, well, I think that's the case for many questions we have around the way the virus has been circulating, of course.
Yes.
We have also questioned about the way China reacting when Kazakhstan closed its border. Was that seen as something kind of unfriendly? Did you have the impression that the way China reported about the Central Asian closing their own border was kind of discussed as something like it's not nice of them doing that to us, or was that kind of more accepted at that time that country would be closing border? Russia closed her border very early.
Well, I didn't see much reporting around that, I think, in the Chinese press. I think at that time, you know, we're talking late January, it was when China was very much under a lot of pressure because the virus is really taking hold. It wasn't clear what was going on at home. You know, there was a lot of domestic pressure. I think at that moment in time, we saw a lot of countries closing their borders to China. Everyone kind of did it at the same time, roughly. And it doesn't seem as though, I didn't see, maybe others did, but I didn't see much evidence of China being very angry that the borders were being closed with Central Asia in particular. But again, maybe I missed the reports, but I didn't really see much of it.
Good. We also now maybe a question more on related to what is happening to China, and I think something really fascinating you mentioned is that the role of this Chinese private sector and firm like Alibaba suddenly entering this kind of connection with Central Asia. And so one of the questions we have is about this kind of new engagement of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Chinese businesses, and especially with Chinese e-commerce companies. Do you see that as a kind of new angle, a kind of new way that will pave the way for this kind of private sector e-companies suddenly also becoming more involved in Central Asia, or SCO trying to push them to be more involved in Central Asia?
I mean, I think this is a look, I think this is, for Central Asia in particular, I think this is fascinating. For the SCO in particular, this is something I'm trying to work on. I'm doing more work on. I'm hoping to publish something else about it at some point in the near term future, because I think that, you know, it's always fascinating to me in sort of the research I've done on the SCO, whenever I've talked to Chinese officials in particular, and actually Central Asian and Russian as well, is they all, they all talk about, and China in particular talks about the SCO as an economic vehicle. They all talk about it as China saw it as a way of engaging, with these countries in an economic way. And China's always been pushing this idea of the SCO as an economic creation. China's been the one that's been pushing the idea of the development bank. They created an interbank, I forget the exact phrase now, interdevelopment bank group, which sort of brings together development banks of the countries to sort of talk regularly. The Chinese have been talking about creating a kind of joint account. They've been talking about creating a free trade area for the region. They very much have been trying to articulate, economic projects through the SCO for some time. And they'd always, frankly, from my understanding, received resistance from two places. One was Uzbekistan, which under Karimov, as we all know, was quite a closed place and wasn't really interested in engaging except on its own terms, and wasn't very interested in the sort of economic story in some ways, or unless it did in very tight, controlled ways. And then also Russia, who I think was fearful of what this might mean for China's sort of dominance of this space. And in some ways, I would argue that what we're seeing, in particular through Alibaba, is the fact that you've got a Chinese platform which appears to be offering itself as a way for this side of the SCO to actually articulate itself and happen. The fact that we saw it's as of mid last year that Alibaba's been talking about connecting with the SCO, and Jack Ma met with the Secretary General and met with some Central Asian leaders and talked about doing this big investment into these countries. I think they're talking about creating, it was investment like $100 million, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, helping really boost the economies, introduce Ant Financial, Alipay, all these different structures that Alibaba has, and interestingly enough, I think if we look at the Central Asians, they'd actually been quite ahead of the curve in terms of using sites like Taobao to kind of position themselves as people who could kind of access these Chinese online platforms and help them sell their products to Russia. This has been happening for some time. I remember as early as, I think, 2013, 14, when I went to Kyrgyzstan, talking to people there who were talking about doing this. In a way, what I argue we're seeing with Alibaba in particular, but actually more broadly with the SCO, because if you look again at just who the Secretary General has been meeting in the past few months while he's been locked in Beijing, he's met with the head of Jingdong, which is another big online Chinese platform. He's been meeting with the Guisha Technical, which is a big kind of cloud company in China. He's been meeting with people from Weidong Cloud Computing. So all of these companies are engaging with kind of the SCO, and we can see how they're also expanding their footprint in the SCO space more broadly, but Central Asia in particular. So in some ways, there's an interesting question in my mind about whether it is through this kind of engagement, we're seeing the realization of what China wanted all along with the SCO, which was an institution which could provide a kind of an umbrella way of engaging with this region economically. It's actually coming about, and very much through this kind of online connectivity, and very much through these large online platforms, and Alibaba in particular.
Great points. We have several questions, of course, about the Central Asia perception of China and the kind of discrepancy we always have between Central Asian government being very positive about China and Central Asian public opinion being much more critical. And do you think that, given the fact that we can interpret China's role in the pandemics both as positive and negative, right, depending how you want to insist on it, do you think there will be a change on the way people will be looking to China more positively or more negatively? And the kind of mirror question, what about the relationship to Russia and the fact that Russia was really not very present in kind of helping Central Asians during the crisis, and Russia has been affected a lot also. So do you think it's kind of also changing the perspective of people on who is here to help when they have to choose between Russia and China? And that's maybe the case, especially for Kazakhstan, where the relationship to Russia has been kind of having kind of up and downs more recently.
Well, I mean, look, I think the polling that you guys did in Kazakhstan in particular really showed that the region looks equally negatively on Russia, on United States and China, and only looks a little bit better at Russia, right? Which I thought was a very, I thought that polling was, well, it's very good work, but it was really interesting articulation of, frankly, a problem I'd always kind of noticed and felt. You know, I think that I don't know that it's going to change much, to be honest with you, because I think that, you know, in my experience of talking to people in Central Asia about their kind of perceptions of China, I'm often struck at the distance between the reality of the relationship and their perceptions of the relationship and what's actually happening. So, you know, for example, some of the narratives around, you know, Chinese companies not employing locals, you know, I don't know that that's actually true. You know what I mean? But I think there's definitely that perception that that's the case. I think in terms of, you know, China burdening these countries with, you know, debts that they don't really want, and that potentially China might call them that shit one day. I mean, yes, it's possible, but, you know, actually it's not clear. In Central Asia, they've rolled over their debts quite a few times, you know, and I think they're probably going to do it again now. So, you know, it always strikes me that while there are lots of problems that Chinese companies, you know, create in Central Asia, if we look at some of the environmental problems that have been created, you know, I think in Kyrgyzstan in particular, there's been some horrible reports of some of the factories there really polluting the environments that they're in. We've certainly seen stories of clashes between locals and Chinese. We've certainly seen stories of Chinese companies being quite abusive of their staff. You know, all of these problems do exist, but I often think that, you know, the kind of public perception is often built on something else, because I've also met Central Asians who, you know, tell me how wonderful some of the infrastructure that they find in China, you know, in Central Asia is, that, you know, where there wasn't a road, there is one now. I remember in Tajikistan in particular, people in Gorno-Badakhshan were, you know, were a bit worried about what's happening with the Chinese, but they also said, you know what, when a Chinese company was commissioned to build the road appeared. When a local company was hired years before, nothing happened. We don't know where the money went. No one got employed. You know what I mean? It was so their perspective was, you know what? We don't know what the government's done to agree with these people, but at the end of the day, we now have a road. So, you know, I think it's always a very complicated kind of relationship. And I don't know that what we're seeing happening now is going to particularly change that. The question for me, though, is the kind of longer term one, because I think in the short to medium term, or short term for certain, I don't think you're going to see a change. In the medium term, maybe. But I think in the longer term, the question is, what do these links mean? You know, and so if we start to see more and more, you know, people getting used to Chinese online platforms, more and more people looking to China as the place where they're kind of making their money and doing their business, you know, the more those kinds of links, that web of connectivity builds at a kind of human to human level, and an economic level in an ever deeper way, you know, I think that will start to change perceptions in the region towards China. And so this narrative of government positive, public skeptical will probably start to get a little bit closer. But I think that's probably in the medium to long term. I think Russia absent, I mean, you know, here I probably defer to you, Marlene, who's far more knowledgeable about Russia in particular. But my sense has always been that I think Central Asians are, much like the Russians, a fairly cynical and skeptical bunch. And I question whether they really expected Russia to do a huge amount for them anyway. And so I don't know that that would have been, you know, whether what's happened would have particularly changed that perception, whether it's accentuated it to a point that means that now they're sort of more disliking Russia, I just don't know. I suspect when you see kind of borders opening and economies getting moving again, I still think you'll see more Central Asians looking for jobs in Russia than you will in China. So I'm not entirely sure what metric that tells us, but I think, you know, it does. There is still that kind of connectivity. But I think the real question for me is in the medium to long term. And I think that can be said about a lot of Chinese connections with the region, because I think in the medium to long term, you will see a kind of change towards China at a kind of structural perception level as well.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Yeah, we have one more question that is, I mean, several more, but one is quite precise and going back to the role of Kyrgyzstan and its participation in the Belt and Road project. What about the fact that the logistic center in Atbashi has been cancelled, and what do you think that means for Kyrgyzstan participation in the kind of broad BRI project?
I mean, I think that the cancellation of the Atbashi, which I realize I might have misreferred to earlier, I apologize. Thank you for correcting me. I think that it's it's a loss, I would argue, for Kyrgyzstan, because I mean it was going to be quite a big logistics center, and it would have been beneficial to the country in terms of helping support their local economy. I think it was cancelled. I don't think that's going to change the kind of role or the appetite in some way for BRI potentially in Kyrgyzstan, but I think it will make Chinese companies question whether they want to bother to push that hard. I think, as we were discussing before, the rail link with Uzbekistan will continue to kind of make sense and will continue to push forward, and that will be a BRI project. So I think we'll see that kind of materialize at some point. There is still utility from a Chinese perspective of having, connectivity into Kyrgyzstan, because it helps ultimately increase trade with southern Xinjiang, which needs, frankly, the trade connectivity. So there is still kind of a benefit to it. But what I do think is you will see, look, Chinese companies have a pretty high risk threshold. They're willing to go into places that other people seem very wary of going. They're willing to take a lot more risk. But I wonder if after that, and I say that particularly about this one because the project was agreed at a meeting when Xi Jinping visited Kyrgyzstan. So it's kind of a slap in the face to the leader himself. So I think from a Chinese perspective, there'll be a real question about any projects in Kyrgyzstan going forwards, because even ones where you've had the boss show up and sign the contract can apparently fall apart. So, to be fair, we've seen this in Kyrgyzstan before. If you think back a few years ago, there was I think a murder of a particular businessman in Kyrgyzstan, which came at a moment when there was a lot of pressure on Chinese businesses in Kyrgyzstan. They were getting a lot of harassment, a lot of grief. People were, getting murdered. And you saw articles appearing in the Chinese press telling the Chinese business community that they should still try to invest in Kyrgyzstan. It was still an opportunity. So, there have been these tensions before, and it's sort of persisted. I think from a Chinese long-term perspective, at the end of the day, they would worry, I think, more if Kyrgyzstan was to really fall into sort of total collapse and disaster. And because that would be right on their border, and that's not something they really want, and that will have knock-on effect. So from their perspective, the idea of building a place up economically does have a kind of positive effect in kind of, in their view, of stabilizing it. So I think that logic will continue to hold. So I'm not sure you'll see a cutoff of BRI from Kyrgyzstan, but I think you'll certainly see some, more T's getting crossed and I's getting dotted, maybe.
Yeah, good point. We have a time for one or two more questions, and we had one about the role of surveillance technology kind of thriving with the pandemics in big cities as a way to control what is happening in the streets, and the fact that it's mostly Chinese production, and this kind of China leading in artificial intelligence and surveillance technology and smartization of cities and so on. How do you think that here also, do you think that the pandemic is in fact just accelerating what already on its way, that the Central Asian government are buying more and more of Chinese technology, especially in the name of the smartization of their cities, and I'm connecting that with what you said previously about Alibaba. So do we really see a kind of e-China becoming e-Chinese business becoming one of the key vector of China's kind of growing role? Before we had energy, we had infrastructure, we had investment. Do you think now it's a kind of the rise of the Chinese businesses all over the region as a kind of new step of presence?
I think it's a really interesting question. So I think on the question of surveillance tech, I think that, yes, you'll continue to see the pattern of activity you'd seen happening until now, which is broadly Central Asians purchasing Chinese technology and using it. I think it's also important to, I think within this particular space, I did some work on it last year, and I did look a little bit at Russia, and I realized Russia's still got some pretty deep roots into the region and its digital life, through some of the kind of legislation that's been signed under the CSTO. This gives Russian, data, Russians access to a lot of data in the region already. But having said that, I think it is certainly the case that, Chinese e-commerce and everything else is going to be one of the kind of increasing stories in the region, and Chinese platforms being used in the region, I think will continue to happen and probably grow going forwards, and that has real questions around what happens to that data and all that information. You know, I know Huawei, I think, had built a big you know, server farm in Xinjiang, which was specifically built to help service the Central Asian markets. So I think you've already started to see that kind of infrastructure be laid. We know that Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision are all very present across the region, are continuing to fulfill contracts. So I think that that certainly is going to be the case. And, you know, I think it's really about Central Asian countries ensuring that they have the mechanisms, legal mechanisms and structures in place to be able to manage this. You know, I think that's really the key to this, because at the end of the day, you know, the question is, where are you going to buy this from, right? And if we think about just 5G, for example, 5G, there's basically three companies: Nokia, Ericsson, and you know, Huawei. And understandably, Huawei has got a leap on everyone in Central Asia because they've been there for such a long time. I mean, Tajikistan was, I think, the first country that got 3G because, you know, Huawei decided to use it as a test ground to do what they wanted. So, you know, these companies have long been working in the region, and I think that this will continue going forward. And I think there's some real thought needs to go in to some of the data management questions in particular around this for Central Asian countries, and to make sure that they do retain some sort of control. So, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is, you know, this idea of, in Europe, they created this thing called GDPR, which is a very sort of aggressive data protection act, which specifically protects individual European data if it leaves kind of European territory. You know, I think Central Asians really start thinking those sorts of terms and develop ombudsman structures within their countries to ensure that they're able to manage this influx. Because I think at this point, the kind of, you know, Chinese tech penetration into the region is kind of an irresistible force that's kind of already there. And I think will only get enhanced going forwards. But I think, you know, it's really a question of making sure you know and are able to control it.
Yeah, very good
the
point.
tools in place.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Raffaello. It's already 10 a.m. So 10 a.m. for us, 10 p.m.
10 p.m. for me.
For you, yes, yes. So I think it's time for us to conclude. It was really a great discussion. I think you are just touching such important points on how the relationship will be evolving in the future. So once again, thank you, and invite everybody to look at your paper online on our website and to stay in touch. We will have 3 events in the first 2 weeks of July, another one on the pandemics and the kind of economic recovery issue. July 6th, first on Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, which are the kind of the two blank spots we have mostly on the way they manage the crisis. Then July 9th on the economic recovery, and then July 16th on the situation of Central Asian migrants in Russia. So I invite you to stay in touch with us. Once again, thank you so much, Raffaello. We applaud you kind of virtually, and we wish you all the best in Singapore. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.